Hi and welcome to our webinar tonight. My name is Rich Harvey, founder and CEO of propertybuyer.com, and I have with me Terry Ryder, the founder and director of Hotspotting. Tonight we're going to be talking about the prospects for Brisbane and Newcastle. These have been two major areas that have been touted by a lot of property commentators as having great potential for capital growth and for good positive yield. So tonight Terry and I are going to be discussing the pros and cons of investing into property into those markets, and we'll really unpack some of the reasons why it potentially could be a good or bad idea, and it'd be great to get your perspective, Terry. But firstly, Terry, welcome to you. Thanks for being on the webinar this evening.
Hi Rich, it's great to be here. Really looking forward to having this discussion and to put some balance perhaps into some of the media commentary that's out and about at the moment in terms of what's happening with real estate across Australia.
That's great. Well, look, before we get into the specifics of Brisbane and Newcastle, Terry, I'm just going to share my screen. I'd really like to get for us both to have a bit of a discussion about where the market's up to. I get asked every day of the week, Rich, where's the market up to? What's happening? Is it going to fall anymore? Is there any areas that are hotspots? What should we be doing? So I thought just before we get into the specifics of Newcastle and Brisbane, let's just have a quick look at where the market's at and where it's heading. So I've got a couple of slides here. So this is, as I said, our cap for tonight. We'll be just doing a little bit of a market introduction, then getting into the case studies at the very end. I guess, Terry, just to start off, we've got to look at also just where is the population numbers right around Australia. Obviously, Sydney and Melbourne lead the charge in terms of population, but Brisbane's certainly up there as number 3, and Newcastle's number 7 on the list. So we've certainly seen some strong population growth around Australia, haven't we?
We certainly have, and I think it's very important to note a couple of points about that, Rich. Firstly, in terms of Brisbane, traditionally Southeast Queensland's been a major gainer from net interstate migration. In recent years that's fallen off a little bit, but the numbers now suggest that it's coming back very strongly. Queensland is now the number 1 gainer from net interstate migration in Australia, ahead of Victoria, and most of that's going to Brisbane and Southeast Queensland. And the other point to note is the size of Newcastle, where it ranks as a city of Australia. It's bigger than 3 of our capital cities. A lot of the media attention in terms of economies and real estate markets tends to be on the capital cities exclusively.
That's right.
And overlooking regional Australia, and we tend to forget that some of our regional cities, including Newcastle and a few others, are actually bigger than a number of our capital cities and have bigger economies and perhaps more important property markets.
Oh, I think that's right. I don't think Hobart seems to be touted as the shooting star at the moment, but I think it's got some limited life left in it. But as you can see on the chart here, Canberra and Hobart and Darwin are all smaller, significantly smaller than Newcastle. So that's an interesting factor to look at. Yeah. What we might do is I should have given you a bit of a plug, Terry, just in terms of your background. Do you want to maybe talk about what you do and how you fit into the property equation?
Well, I've been around real estate in Australia as a researcher and a writer for over 30 years, and for the last 12 years my main occupation has been the hotspotting.com.au website, which is designed basically to help real estate consumers around Australia to identify the future growth areas before they become growth areas, so that people are buying at the optimum time for future growth, as opposed to what most consumers tend to do, which is pile into markets when they read there's a boom on, which is not necessarily sensible investing. You might want to tell us a little bit about yourself, Rich, because I keep noticing that you keep on winning national awards as the best in the business. You must be getting a little bit tired of winning all these awards.
Oh, well, thanks, Tara. I appreciate it. Yeah, I went to the Optus Business Awards last Friday night, and we didn't win, but we were finalists in the property services category for Australia-wide. But we've actually won as a company over 30 awards for excellence. Just a quick background for those that don't know me: I'm an exclusive buyer's agent, and my company, propertybuyer.com.au, helps investors, home buyers and commercial buyers find exactly the right property that they're after. We use your research, Terry. We use a number of other data sources to help pinpoint areas that are going to be ideal for our investors growing their portfolio. And we run the whole process, and we charge a flat fee for doing that. But we're in business, I think, 17 years this year. And we certainly love helping people to achieve their property dreams. So Terry, that's enough about us two. Let's get more into the content now, and perhaps you can just take us through where prices are moving around Australia.
Yeah, I think it's really important for people to understand what's really going on in Australian real estate, because we have this constant diet of headlines and sound bites in our national media telling us that Australian property prices are falling. They're tending to imply that markets are falling everywhere. And of course, that's completely not the case. Really, the opposite is true. We have many strong rising markets around Australia. And I think what's happening, Rich, is that a lot of our major national media comes out of Sydney, and people writing the articles and making the commentary are sitting in Sydney, surrounded by negativity in terms of the end of the boom in Sydney, and they're extrapolating that into a national situation. What the data actually shows us, and what I have on screen is the recent report from CoreLogic, where they divide Australia into 14 major market jurisdictions. Each of the 8 capital cities is a market, and then you've got 6 major regional markets: New South Wales regional, Victorian regional, etc. And their latest figures show that in 9 of those 14 major markets across Australia, prices are higher than a year ago. It's only in 5 of them, in fact, that prices are down. And unfortunately, according to these figures, Sydney is down quite a bit, and it's dragging down the capital city average and producing a negative figure as the average for capital city Australia. And that's what media is reporting. And that's the reason why we're getting those headlines telling us that prices are falling across Australia, which quite clearly isn't the case. And the next slide, I think Rich actually makes that point even more strongly. An analysis by CoreLogic recently divided Australia, well, they were using the 88 sub-regions that the Australian Bureau of Statistics uses to collect data on all manner of things, and they were looking at what are property prices doing in each of those 88 sub-regions that make up Australia, and found that in half of them, prices are actually growing, including growing more strongly than their 5-year average. And in the majority of those locations where prices are growing, prices are up in 40% of our capital city sub-regions, and in regional Australia, they're up in 60% of those sub-regions. And that's one of the things we're finding, Rich, in our research, is that many of the strongest markets right now are actually in regional Australia, which tend to be pretty much totally ignored in media coverage.
That's a really good point, Terry, because I think a lot of people that live in the cities just want to keep investing in the cities. And I think that's one of the things you can make a mistake as an investor, is to only invest in your own backyard. You do need to be a borderless investor, and you do need to think well beyond your own backyard, but don't dive in boots and all just because you see a hot tip in a magazine or one podcast. Terry, some of the information you put out is excellent, which looks at rising sales volumes. You also got to look at vacancy factor and a whole host of other localised factors that we'll dive into, and that's what we're going to be talking about today, specifically about Brisbane and Newcastle and all the sub-markets that are within those types of markets.
You mentioned there, Rich, just before we get on to discussing Newcastle in detail, vacancy rates, and there was a report out very recently from SQM Research that noted that the average national vacancy rate has dropped quite a lot, and in all our capital cities except one, vacancy rates are down quite strongly compared to where they were 12 months ago. So it's a very strong factor for property markets in the largest cities around Australia that vacancies are so low, in some cases below 1%. Even in cities like Perth, where vacancies have been high, they've come down a lot in the last 12 months.
Yeah.
And so that's starting to put pressure on rentals in some of our bigger cities. And when rent starts to rise, that tends to also put pressure on prices. So it's just one part of the equation that's pointing to growth in at least some of the major areas of Australia.
Okay, great. Thanks, Terry. Well, look, we'll dive into that a little bit more as we go forward. So, but look, let's move now on to Newcastle, Terry. I'd like to really unpack the Newcastle market. I think it's a really attractive city, just under 2 hours north of Sydney. And Newcastle, again, is made up of many markets. You've got the Lake Macquarie region to the south of Newcastle. Then you've got the whole Hunter region to the west of Newcastle. It's really stepped into the limelight in the last couple of years. In fact, I'm not sure if you're aware, Terry, but Lonely Planet actually ranked Newcastle as one of the top 10 cities in the world. And recently, National Geographic highlighted Newcastle as one of the smart cities in the world. And in the CBD, they've actually got free Wi-Fi. And it's also known for being one of Australia's most sophisticated Internet of Things platforms. In Newcastle, you've also got a flourishing arts scene. You've got lots of theatres and galleries. You've got some beautiful beaches like Merewether Beach. It's also surrounded by some beautiful bushland. So it's a really, really attractive area. And obviously, a lot of people are attracted by the wineries around the Hunter Valley area, which is a great spot for a visit.
Yeah.
What things do you like about Newcastle, Terry?
Well, I like a lot about it, Rich. It's interesting that what you've said about how it's perceived in some of those publications, because Newcastle tends to have, I guess, an image in the minds of a lot of people of being an industrial city. It certainly has that element, but really it's got all these other lifestyle factors. I mean, it's got wonderful beaches. It's got, as you mentioned, the Hunter Valley region with the wine and of course the horse industry also out there in the Hunter region. It's got great lifestyle aspects. So it's a city that offers a lot to people. It's one of the reasons why I think this market has risen. People have looked at it and said, well, this is not only a place where real estate is more affordable than Sydney, but it also looks like a great place to live. And it's also a place that, because it's got a strong and rising economy, it can provide jobs and careers for people. So it really ticks all the boxes for people, both home buyers and investors, because it's got all those multiple elements: strong economy, great lifestyle, and the prospect for rising real estate prices.
That's right, yeah. Well, I guess I've just got to check what my next slide is. I think we need to just also ask Terry, what are the key drivers of the economy? What do you think are the things that are really going to drive that Newcastle region and that economy forward?
Yeah, look, we always look for diversity in economies, particularly when we're looking at regional centres. We don't want one-horse towns. We don't want regional centres that are dependent on the mining industry or dependent on agriculture only for its prosperity. And the thing about Newcastle is it has so many strands to its economy. Firstly, it's the largest coal export port in the world. It's got a major sort of industrial base to it. It's also got a very strong tourism industry. It's hooked into the nearby Hunter region, which adds to the diversity through energy generation, tourism, the horse breeding industry, the wine industry, and elements of the resources sector as well. So all those things are part of Newcastle. It's also got a very strong construction sector. There's a lot going on in terms of infrastructure creation and also construction of apartments and other forms of dwelling. So that's making a very strong construction sector for Newcastle as well. And then when you add to that the relative affordability of the dwellings there and the lifestyle factor, it starts to look very, very attractive to a whole range of people.
I think so also, Terry, one of the things, just in addition to what you've talked about with the mining, the tourism and innovation, is also the student population. The University of Newcastle provides quite a pool of talent to a lot of the local employers around the town. Tourism injects around $2.5 billion into the region, and that's increasing apparently around 2% a year. And those numbers are growing, but the new university is certainly proving to be a very attractive reason for people to locate there.
Yeah, and it's an expanding institution as well. I think any city of any sort that's got a major educational economy with a big university campus has an extra element of strength to its property market, because all those students provide really strong demand for rental property. And part of what's happening in Newcastle at the moment is the evolution of the CBD of Newcastle, for a lot of things happening there to turn that into a more vibrant and livable space. And part of that is moving of at least part of the university campus into the CBD. And so that's going to be part of the dynamic that's going to make the Newcastle downtown areas more vibrant and lively than they previously have been.
I think, Terry, we just turn more just to the underlying strength of the Newcastle economy. And I think you've mentioned about the Port of Newcastle. It's actually one of the oldest ports in Australia, and it's the world's largest coal exporting facility. Coal represents over 90% of the total tonnage that goes in and out of that area. So it's actually quite, even though they're big coal ships, it's actually quite interesting to sit there, have a coffee at those little cafes just on the entrance to the inlet there and just watch them go up and down. They're such massive ships. But the other thing that's happened, apart from the coal industry, it's diversified into manufacturing and energy exports. It's got a range of healthcare, a lot of education and training, retail trades, and construction and tourism. So it's gross regional product for the area. In other words, the value of all the goods and services that are produced in that region adds up to almost $17 billion a year. We've also got the Newcastle Airport, and the Sydney-Newcastle Railway provides pretty easy links to and from the city. And that Hunter region itself contributes around $32 billion to the Australian economy. So it's a very well structured, and it's just because I think when BHP had a few wobbles there, everyone thought, oh, Newcastle's going to close its doors. Well, far from it. It's really gone ahead in leaps and bounds.
Yeah, you mentioned the airport. It's also a major RAF base, and in
Williamstown.
A strong military economy is also a major asset for a regional city. One of the things I like perhaps the most about Newcastle is that it's a great example of how regional cities reinvent themselves when situations change. So there was a time when Newcastle was almost declared dead because the biggest employer in town, BHP, shut up shop and left. And of course, as often is the case when things like that happen, immediately declared that it was the end of Newcastle. But as so often the case, cities like Newcastle don't die easily. They actually work very hard to reinvent themselves, and Newcastle's done that with huge success. It's just changed the nature of what it does in terms of its economy. It's evolved into something that's a little bit different from what it was, say, 20 years ago, and now it's one of the strongest cities in Australia. And it's a great object lesson because we've seen other examples around Australia where industry is perhaps closed down, and a lot of negativity has been expressed in media about those places, but they've fought back, reinvented themselves and gone forward and become stronger cities than they were before. Newcastle is probably the best example of it.
That's right. I agree, Terry. And again, there's all those other factors. I mean, I've got a photo there of the beach, and you've got the all of those attractive natural amenities, which is really making people want to go there and go, you know what, I'm sick of Sydney traffic or Melbourne traffic. I'm going to move to a regional area that's thriving. And this is one of those areas that we think has a lot of legs and a great future ahead of it.
Yeah.
And Terry, go on.
We've talked about the economy of Newcastle, and it's important to understand that a lot of people think that everything that happens in regional markets is somehow tied to the capital cities, and it's like they catch the ripple effect from the boom in the big cities. I think to a certain extent that's what's happened with Newcastle, but the most important thing is what's happening locally. I think that real estate markets, whether they're rising or falling, is very strongly tied to what's happening to the local economy. So places like Newcastle have their own reasons for growth. It's not just about their links to the capital city, although in Newcastle's case, that is an additional benefit.
Okay, that's good. So Terry, let's talk about population. What's the population data showing? We had that initial slide there, but my understanding now is the population's now over, if you include the Hunter, over 726,000 people. What are you seeing in terms of population data in this area?
Well, what you say is true, and those numbers are really strong and impressive numbers in terms of the population for this region. And again, it just reiterates just how important the city it is. It's one of the largest, I think the seventh biggest urban area in Australia, and it's not far off. It's, as we mentioned, bigger than Hobart, Darwin, Canberra, but it's also almost as big as a city like Adelaide because its population is growing so strongly when you include the surrounding regions, including Port Stephens, the Hunter region, and Lake Macquarie local government area. Certainly growing very strongly because of the lifestyle, because the economy is strong and it's creating jobs, because the infrastructure has improved. And all these are things that are attractive to people and bring them into the area to live and work, not just invest.
That's right. Yeah. And Terry, the rental market. Let's talk a bit about the rental market now. You've mentioned originally that the figures from SQM, but when I just looked up before our webinar tonight, they're saying that the Hunter region is actually getting a much tighter a vacancy rate, down to 1.2%. And Newcastle, right in the centre of the city, is almost down to 1%. But there's certainly areas where, I mean, previously, if you go further up the Hunter, up to Singleton and those sort of areas, they're still struggling a little bit, but I know the yields, that the vacancies come down. But what's your comment on vacancy rate in that area?
Well, they're really tight now. Now, there was a period going back a number of years when the vacancy rates were much higher. The Hunter region previously was a boom market, and as sometimes happens, developers piled in there and built a lot of new product, and that coincided with a temporary downturn in the coal sector. So we ended up in some of those towns, such as Muswellbrook, with an oversupply of properties. But in recent years, that has been soaked up. Vacancies have come down to not only that 3% comfort level, but well below them. And we're now starting to see sales activity rising again very strongly in those towns, such as Maitland, Singleton, Muswellbrook, Cessnock. Vacancies are now very low, rents are rising, sales activity is rising, and we're starting to see that reflected in price growth as well. But what it all means is that the rental yields are very attractive in those areas, particularly compared to the bigger cities. You might be talking 2 to 3% in some cases. In the bigger cities and in areas like the Hunter region, you're talking around about 5% or more on houses, which starts to look very attractive to investors out in the bigger cities.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to be covering off of that in a minute, Terry, just giving some examples of what we've done recently for our clients, but where you can get an existing home, house on a block of land and get a 5% yield. There's other creative ways that you can actually then even boost that yield much greater through doing renovations, through granny flats, through duplexes, and adding more value to the property. So it's really significant that you don't have to invest in your own backyard to generate a yield. And these areas where you can buy in that have got the right drivers can really help accelerate your portfolio further. It's really important to look at what not just the growth drivers, but the drivers for rentals. And these are areas that are really strong going forward. I guess I just want to talk now about, before we go into the specific suburbs, is about infrastructure, Terry. We've talked to it generally, but I want to talk about some of the really key infrastructure projects that are going into Newcastle. And a couple that I'd like to mention straight away is the light rail that's going from Wickham Station to Newcastle Beach. Now, that's nearing completion. They expect that to be operational sometime in early 2019. It hasn't had the same length of problems that the light rail in Sydney's had, but a light rail really injects a whole new sort of atmosphere and a whole new dynamic to downtown Newcastle. So having that coming right into the centre of the city, it's really going to make movements of people and goods a lot easier. The other key thing that's happening is the new university campus that opened up last year. It's a $95 million university space innovation hub, and it's right there in that honeysuckle precinct. And that's really improved a lot of amenity in that area too. So a lot more students and a lot more investment has come into that area. Another key thing, Terry, that's happened in terms of infrastructure is an investment in a permanent cruise ship terminal. So a lot of the cruise ships now are doing a stop-off in Newcastle. So they've spent another $12 billion building that at Carrington, and that's already improving the infrastructure that's existing there. So are there any other thoughts you've got around infrastructure spend or any other projects you wanted to mention, Terry?
Yeah, well, perhaps one that's already in place, and that's the Hunter Expressway. That was a big ticket item built, completed a couple of years ago. But that was important then. It continues to be important because it's improved the linkages to Sydney, for example, and that is a factor that's in Newcastle's favour, that it's so strongly connected to the capital city, and the Hunter Expressway has been part of that, and it's part of an ongoing program of improvement in road networks around the Newcastle and Hunter region. That's very important. There's also massive expansion happening at the RAF base and Newcastle Airport, which are a combined facility. that's an investment of around about $1 billion that's ongoing. And then you've got out in the Hunter region, big spending in the resources and energy sector that's ongoing as well. It all feeds into the local economy. At the end of the day, what's the most important thing in terms of what comes out of an economy feeding into real estate markets is the creation of jobs, particularly as it brings new people to come and live in an area, and that's certainly a dynamics that's part of this region.
I think you mentioned that Newcastle Expressway. I've got some friends and a couple of people that I know that have moved up there, and they're living in places like Branxton and areas like Greta, just outside of Newcastle. It's only a 20-30 minute, even for Colburn there, and it's just a short drive into the city, and it's so efficient now. It's a really pleasant drive, and that reduction in travel times has really opened up a significant amount of infrastructure and investment and job creation in that Hunter Valley area. So I think there'll be a lot of land developers moving into that area, looking to build some house and land. And we've also seen a rapid rise in the number of apartments built in downtown Newcastle as people want to downsize and move closer to the action. So all of that augurs well for the local economy. So Terry, let's move on to some sort of more juicy stuff, and let's talk about some specific hotspots. That's the name of your business, but let's have a look at perhaps some areas that have performed well, and maybe you can take us through where median prices have been moving in various suburbs here.
Yeah, well, I think it's fair to say that Newcastle has been one of the strongest markets in Australia in the last 12 or 18 months. We've already seen in the last 12 months some substantial price growth in Newcastle City. Many of the suburbs of Newcastle had double-digit growth in their median house prices in the last 12 months, and some of those are on the screen. It's been spread right across the market because some of those locations on the screen, such as Hamilton, are perhaps at the more upmarket end. But also some of the cheaper areas like Mayfield also had substantial price growth. And then you've got the Newcastle CBD, because you mentioned a number of times the evolving revitalisation of the Newcastle CBD with the injection of elements like the light rail, the university campus and other factors. And there's been some new apartment construction, and that's leading to price growth in the inner city as well. But what we're now seeing is that the growth is rippling out to some of those nearby areas. The Lake Macquarie local government area is one that stands out. That's an opportunity because that's a little bit further back in the cycle, I think, than Newcastle City itself. And it presents an opportunity both for home buyers and investors because some of those areas are a little bit more affordable than downtown Newcastle. And they also have some very nice lifestyle elements, suburbs clustered around Lake Macquarie itself. So that's very much an evolving market that's worth consideration, I think, by investors. And some of those places are now starting to show strong growth, as the numbers on the screen indicate. And we're seeing Port Stephens as well get on board. It's perhaps catching a ripple effect. I mean, that's one of the most beautiful areas, I think, in terms of beaches and waterside living anywhere in Australia. Some of those locations like Nelson Bay and Salamander Bay, just gorgeous environments, and they've caught a bit of a ripple effect from the upcycle in Newcastle, and we're seeing quite substantial uplift in prices there as well. Yeah, and including places like Raymond Terrace, which isn't on the water. It's quite close to the airport and RAF base, and so that's part of its economy. And people sort of, one of the things that we know from the research is that people want to live close to where they work if they can, and so a lot of people have reason to be living in a place like Raymond Terrace, very close to downtown Newcastle. They want to go there, or very close to the sort of the bayside areas of Port Stephens as well. And then latterly, we've got the Hunter region, the towns out there in the Hunter region, such as Cessnock and Maitland, and increasingly places like Singleton and Muswellbrook are getting on board as well. Demand is rising. We see that in our quarterly research on sales volumes. Very strong uplift in demand in those Hunter region towns, and prices are starting to follow. And I'm sure, Rich, I know that your team is active in this area, so you're probably experiencing all of that when you're out there at the coalface.
Absolutely. I think, a lot of those suburbs there we're actively buying in, and we've also got some other secret suburbs that aren't listed there, Terry, that we're buying in as well. So we don't give away all of our secret sauce, but certainly, those areas that have got, that affordability component. I mean, you mentioned Hamilton. Yeah, sure, it's relatively expensive, but there's other areas between there and the freeway that are still very, very affordable and only a short distance. I mean, traffic in Newcastle is a problem in peak hour, but not nearly the same as like Melbourne, Sydney or Brisbane. But some of the areas that I think are particular hotspots is an area like Mayfield, which you've indicated there. You've also got other suburbs like Islington, which used to be the red light district, Tyers Hill and Maryville. But also you've got the biggest TAFE in Newcastle around there near Waratah Station. And you mentioned Lake Macquarie too. Again, I've got friends that have moved to that area. They love it. It's just a really attractive area. You've got the beach, you've got the waterways, you can go fishing, water skiing, canoeing, kayaking. You've got all of those lifestyle features that are attracting not just investors, but people that want a great lifestyle for their kids, but still want to be within cooee of Sydney. So we think there's still a lot more transformation to come as people rediscover areas where they don't have to move, right out into the sticks, but they can move to a lovely coastal town that's really thriving and got a great population base. But and all of those suburbs, though, they have a lot of different drivers, and it's about understanding how close they are to specific amenity. It's understanding how close they are to a particular transport connection or a particular education facility. It's understanding, how busy the roads are at certain times of the day. There's certain other factors that you've got to consider just because you see something that says 23%, should I go and invest there? Well, no, there's other questions you need to ask and need to understand before you jump in there. But we're active in a lot of those areas as well.
The thing I love about this area, Rich, is the variety of lifestyles that are available. We've talked about downtown Newcastle and all the amenity that's coming into that area. And then you've got Lake Macquarie with that lake-based living, Port Stephens, which is oceanside living, and it's just a gorgeous part of the world. And then out in the Hunter region, close to the wine region. So, depending on which sort of lifestyle you favour, you've got 3 or 4 excellent choices in that the whole Newcastle region.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And Terry, you've already mentioned about sales volumes. I don't think we have a slide on that, do we? Just check. No, I'm going to strategies next. But I think the key thing to talk about is that not just yourself, but there's other urban planners, other economists that are all predicting these areas have very strong potential. As we mentioned, we've seen the vacancy rates come down. So we're seeing obviously more renters are coming to these areas, so it's more attractive. But I guess another question is, Terry, what property types are in highest demand in these areas? We, as an investor, you need to consider buying the right type of property in these particular areas. And what we're seeing, Terry, is that the best kind of property to buy in these areas is actually houses most of the time, because that's the way you can get some land component and add value. We've put a number of our clients into apartments at a different stage in the cycle. About 3 to 4 years ago, before the market really took off, we handpicked a number of projects. We were able to get our clients into various projects, and they made between 20 and 30% increase in about an 18-month period. But the off-the-plan strategy, again, is you've got to be very careful and very selective in how you use it. But generally, I would be advising investors out there to consider buying an established home and adding some value, and I'll give you some strategies on that in a minute. But any other thoughts, Terry, about property types in most demand in these areas?
Yeah, I think you're going to talk a little bit more about it shortly, Rich, but I'm aware that particularly out in the Hunter region, there are opportunities for investors to buy properties where you can do additional things, where you can maybe subdivide to create a second property, or you can knock a house down and build townhouses. There are zonings and land sizes out in that region that allow those sort of value-adding strategies, so you can do things a little bit more proactive than passive investment and speed up the process. Certainly, I know I've got a mentoring client who bought out in the Maitland region recently, and it was a house on land that was rentable in the short term, but in the long term, you have the ability to knock that down and build half a dozen townhouses.
Yeah, brilliant. Excellent. Well, look, I might just move straight into that straight now and just talk about some potential strategies. And I'll give these are some case studies. We've got 5 case studies I'd like to share with you about what we've done recently for our clients. So this was a property that we bought. I won't mention the suburb, but it's very close into the CBD of town. It kind of looks like the equivalent of Paddington in Sydney. It's a row of terraces. It was partially renovated. We bought this for $635,000. We actually got it under market value because we were able to buy it pre-auction. And the way we did that was just having a great relationship with the agent, Kevin Mason in my team, who's our Newcastle specialist on the ground there. He's got a great relationship with a lot of agents, able to get across a lot of properties quickly. It's currently renting for $520 a week, but the thing we liked about it was potential to renovate further. So they'd done the bathroom and partially done the kitchen, but it had more uptick for going further. So this was just a good opportunity to buy an existing property where we could just add a little bit of value, but it's one of those sort of buy and hold and hold for a couple of cycles, and you do very, very well out of it. And it's an area that's growing around that 10% per annum mark. So another example, we bought an existing property which already had a flat constructed. So I love the idea of adding a second stream of income. So we found this property, which was a 4-bed house and already had a 2-bed flat. Again, we were able to secure it prior to auction. On this particular one, we're able to get $350 a week for the house and $325 for the flat. So a combined rent of $675, and that boosted the yield to just over 6%. So again, that's a great kind of property where you can just put that, it can be useful for your self-managed super fund or just add that to your portfolio, but a great opportunity for an investor there. Another one we did where we did both a subdivision and a renovation. So this one here was more of the inner city area of Newcastle, but we found a terrace home that had been split in two. It was originally 2 terraces and they'd combined them, but there was the potential to reinstate them as 2 separate terraces. So we got this one for $815,000. They were asking $850, but it's a decent floor space. We're able to get a heritage architect because there's a few heritage items at the back to give us some advice, but we're able to add an extra 45 square metres of space to this one. And the reno cost was around $160,000. But we're able to get quite a significant uplift in value for these ones. So the valuation on the individual terraces came in at $750. So quite a significant uplift in equity for this particular investor. Close to town, close to beach. But another great strategy whereby we found a property, had renovation and subdivision potential for a big equity uplift.
So Rich, am I seeing those numbers correctly that your client basically spent $970,000 and ended up with a property worth $1.5 million?
That's correct. That's right. Yeah. So equity increase of around $400,000 after all the expenses. So quite a significant uplift. Great opportunity to really accelerate your portfolio. Another one we did here was an existing. It was basically a house that was converted into 2 flats. We were able to subdivide that property into the 2 individual flats. And the land size was such that we can also potentially add a granny flat into the backyard as well down the track. So the current yield we're getting is $660 a week, which is just over 5.7. And again, an area where it's got really strong potential to get capital growth. So not every property has these dual income strategies. They are good. Not to say one's better than the other, but if you can get additional income, it's a great way to show serviceability, particularly when bank financing is so much harder. The other option we've got that we've done for clients is this strategy, which we did several of these at Cameron Park a number of years ago, and some good friends of mine did this and did well. We found a number of blocks in a new estate. We're able to cherry pick the right blocks in this particular estate. And it's predominantly an owner-occupied area. So most of the owner-occupiers buy in this area. The actual land developer didn't want to have investors in there. So we had to go in there a bit undercover and pretend that we were buying for our home buyers who actually ended up being investors. But we picked some really good blocks. We helped the builder to actually design the right kind of property. So it was a 4-bed plus 2-bed property all under one roof. So it's dual living. We even also helped him design a 3+3 style. So depending on the site costs, they range between the total land and build cost of around $720 to $800. and we ended up getting the rent slightly higher. I've been a bit conservative in that number there. We actually ended up getting about 820 to 850 on some of them because it was in high demand. So really strong yields. Obviously the benefit of buying brand new is you get high depreciation, but I'm not always a fan of buying new just because it takes longer, and there's a few delays, but sometimes it can work. So again, if we can find the right opportunities to do it, we did it, but our bunch of investors that did this did extremely well.
I think also, Rich, depending on how you do these new build strategies, but there's also can be substantial savings in stamp duty.
That's right.
Essentially, not paying stamp duty on the whole value of the property.
That's right. So if your build process, these took about 7 to 8 months to build. So your land cost was about 250 to 280,000. So you're only paying stamp duty on the land component, not the 300 to 400 grand on the build cost. So kind of what you save on the stamp duty, you kind of lose on the lack of rent for that period of time. But sometimes it can actually be more attractive to actually do a new build because everything's lower maintenance and everything's shiny as well.
Yeah.
All right. So look, I think that's it for Newcastle. I guess, well, last couple of questions, Terry. Are there any areas to avoid? Are there any kind of, you write these great no-go zone reports, but are there any areas you'd say, look, stay away from this part of Newcastle?
Look, there's none that spring to mind, Rich, at all. There's certainly no Newcastle area locations in our no-go zones report at the moment. It's just an area where I see a lot of uplift potential, both downtown Newcastle, out at Lake Macquarie, and extending up to those towns of the Hunter region.
Okay, I think look, some of the sort of people I talk to don't actually like, some of the locals don't like the inner city parts because they think it's too congested and they prefer to be just out of the city. But I think there's potentially a little bit of oversupply coming into the apartment market in some parts of the CBD of Newcastle. But I do think that'll be a temporary. It won't be a long-term oversupply. But I think, look, I guess to wrap up the Newcastle discussion, Terry, the question I pose to you is: is the Newcastle market a safe long-term buy and hold market, or do you consider it to be a trade in and out market?
No, certainly not a trade market, Rich. I think it's a market that's got long-term potential because of the size of the city, the size of the economy, its links to surrounding areas like the Hunter region. I think it's a market that's got really strong long-term potential. It's going to continue to be one of the most important cities in Australia. We've mentioned a number of times that it's substantially bigger than some of our capital cities, and I think that's going to continue to be the case.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, Terry. I think, the Newcastle, Lake Macquarie, Cessnock and Maitland local government areas they've been really consistent for growth. I think they've got a lot of potential for growth going forward. I'd also think that buying a house anywhere within the proximity of the beach from Newcastle or Redhead, you're going to do really, really well. But I think the three keys that I'd be looking for in the Newcastle region are suburbs between the city, the hospital and the university. They're some of the three key drivers in that local market. Places like Hamilton, it's a bit like the inner west of Sydney, but I think those areas are going to do particularly well. Also areas like New Lambton, that's close to the hospital, but finding opportunities where you can do a reno or add a granny flat or do a duplex, really they're very, very safe and solid strategies, and we help our clients every day of the week to buy in there. So if you're in that category, we'd certainly love to help you in doing that strategy.
So the fact that we haven't really emphasised too much, but it stands out for me in my visits to Newcastle, which is that it's quite a hilly place.
Yes.
It's a lot of great real estate with great views in Newcastle. That's one of the factors that stands out for me.
Yeah, that's right. So it's not a flat environment. You can actually buy some properties with decent views in that area. Yeah, good point, Terry. All right, let's move on, Terry, now to Brisbane. Let's have a chat about the prospects for the Brisbane market as we go forward. There's a nice shot of the Story Bridge there over the Brisbane River, which hopefully won't flood again for another 50 years or so. But Terry, what are your thoughts on the Brisbane market for going forward as an investment location? What are your opening thoughts on the Brisbane area?
For the last couple of years, Rich, a lot of people have predicted that Brisbane's going to boom the way Sydney does. I think a lot of people just assume that Brisbane would follow Sydney. I think they're not understanding the dynamics that create real estate upcycles. Brisbane hasn't had in place the factors that pushed Sydney forward. But I think my point about Brisbane is that the missing elements are all starting to fall into place. The ducks are starting to fall into line for Brisbane. Sydney's boom was driven by a very strong underlying economy, big spending on infrastructure, and very strong population growth, particularly from overseas migrants. Those elements are all starting to line up for Brisbane. They've been missing to a certain degree up till now, which is why Brisbane hasn't got on board with a city-type boom. But we're seeing substantial improvements in the Queensland economy. We're seeing a big uplift now, starting around about now, moving forward in spending on big infrastructure in Brisbane. The recent state budget had an infrastructure spend of about $48 billion over 4 years. Not all of it's Brisbane, but a lot of it is. And there's some big ticket items now starting in and around inner city Brisbane. And we're starting to see the population numbers starting to come back strongly. As I mentioned earlier, Queensland is now the #1 state for net interstate migration. And our research shows that 90% of the population growth in Queensland actually happens in southeast Queensland. So it's Brisbane, the Gold Coast, the Sunshine Coast.
That's a big number, 90%. That's a huge factor, isn't it, Terry?
It is. So most of the people who migrate from interstate to Queensland are going to southeast Queensland. And so that's a big further boost to Brisbane. So we're starting to see the Queensland economy creating jobs in big numbers again. The resources sector is coming back strongly. Tourism is strong. Agriculture is strong. And I think that infrastructure spend factor is massive. I just think it's possibly the single biggest factor. Sydney's been massive for that. Melbourne's been pretty strong as well. Brisbane's been lacking, but it's starting to change. And from this point onwards, we're going to be seeing tens of billions of dollars being spent on big projects, expansion of the airport, the seaport, ferry terminal for cruise liners, the Howard Street Wharves project, all those big lifestyle projects, as well as major rail linkage type developments as well. So it's all starting to happen for Brisbane. I think so. We're going to see much better performance in the property market going forward.
Right.
And the final factor is, of course, the affordability comparison. Whenever they survey investors, like Pippa does a survey of its investor members, so where next are you going to target your investment? Brisbane always tops the poll because I think people out of Sydney and Melbourne look at the prices and the rental yields and compare it to where they're sitting in those two biggest cities and think how attractive Brisbane looks. They just got to believe it's going to grow.
Yeah. Well, look, talking of growth, Terry, I just got the chart here that's from Biz Oxford Economics, used to be Biz Shrapnel, and these are their projections for the 2018 to 2021 house price growth. So they're saying that Brisbane's going to be top of the charts at 13% over the next 3 years. So that's what their prediction is. So, while we've seen, Sydney and Melbourne are certainly having a natural correctional phase, it doesn't mean you can't make money in those markets. We're still buying in those markets and doing very well, doing some other strategies for our clients there. But the last boom in Brisbane was really 2008. I think there's still some oversupply to be absorbed in Brisbane, particularly in the apartment market, and we'll talk a bit about that in a minute. But apartment completions have reduced from around 7,000 in 2016 to around 6,500 in 2017. And by the end of this year, the apartment numbers will be down about 4,600. So apartments are still coming up out of the ground. There's a lot of projects in the apartment market that actually won't get built. There's quite a significant number that have been approved, but unlikely to make economic sense to go forward. So I guess that's the drag on the Brisbane market. But I think it's certainly a bright, shining star. And we're not just talking about apartments. We're talking about houses and other types of properties in that market.
I think the comment I'd make about the numbers on the screen, which is that BIS Oxford Economics, they're always very, very conservative with their growth projections.
Yes.
They always understate.
Yeah.
They'd rather err on the side of understating than overstating the predicted growth. So, in recent years, they've predicted growth for Sydney, but the actual growth that's happened has been much bigger than their prediction. So I think Brisbane's going to do better than that.
Yeah.
Some of those other cities as well, I think, will do better than that because they are very quite deliberately, I think, conservative with their projections.
Yeah, I agree. I think Frank Gilbert does a great job. He's a veteran of the property industry, and yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that. I've been watching these figures that they produce, and they're one of the more trustworthy property data providers out there. So I guess, look, Terry, let's have a chat about the key drivers of the Brisbane market. You've mentioned infrastructure, and I'm just like you. I talk about infrastructure, population, and employment as the key things. So there's been very strong interstate migration going into the Brisbane market. We've also seen stronger yields, a bit like Brisbane. So Newcastle, Brisbane also is experiencing good, strong yields going forward.
Yep.
And we're also seeing it, recovery after the mining boom has deflated. Also strong tourism. But what do you see as the other major drivers going forward for the Brisbane market?
Yeah. We've already touched on the major ones. I think population, improving economy, and a big lift in infrastructure spending, and then, of course, the prices and yields comparison. I suppose the additional factor to mention is the recently announced, a little bit earlier this year, Brisbane City Council policy to restrict the development of medium and high density in certain suburbs. There's been a bit of there's been a push in all our major cities to increase density to try and contain population growth in the existing full footprint of cities to avoid further urban sprawl. But there's been a bit of a backlash from residents to, townhouse development and small unit development in their suburbs. So Brisbane City Council has brought in recently a policy of kind of banning more development of that sort in a number of suburbs, particularly in the inner and middle ring areas. And so that would tend to put upward pressure on prices for houses on land in those areas. So that's a factor to look for, I think. There's still more information to come out about how that's going to work and where all the areas that are going to be covered by that policy are. But I think it's going to help push up prices in Brisbane, generally speaking.
That's an interesting factor because it's similar to Sydney in a way, isn't it? With the what they call the manor house legislation, or the missing middle, which was drafted by the Department of Planning, and then 57 council says no, we don't want it. How do we apply this legislation? So there's been a big backlash, 12-month moratorium put on that, which again limits development, which again limits supply, which then puts pressure on prices. So it's good for investors because it means there's not going to be a new upswing in supply, but it's interesting the same sort of phenomenon is happening in Brisbane as well.
Yeah.
Go on.
Just to reiterate what you said, in the city of Ryder in Sydney, for example, they put a moratorium on rezonings and further development to try and avoid, to allow infrastructure, I guess, to catch up with the development that's happened already. So we're starting to see a similar approach in some of these areas of Brisbane, and as you say, those kind of tend to put upward pressure on prices.
I guess, Terry, the underlying strength of the Brisbane economy, we've talked about new jobs being created, we've talked about some infrastructure. I guess, can we talk about some specific areas of Brisbane that you think, will drive the economy? I mean, we've got you've got Ipswich, you've got the northern region, you've got the Logan Shire. Are there any particular areas or particular job nodes that you see will really perform and help improve property prices in Brisbane?
I mean, we could talk about a lot of different areas, but because there's different areas of Brisbane that all have their own potentials, and Ipswich is certainly one of those. Logan City in the south is one of those. But we don't have time to really go into detail for all of them, but perhaps if we could focus on the Moreton Bay region up in the north as an example of the potentials. I think we have a slide there.
Oh, sorry, I'll go to the next one.
With some of the information on that.
There we go. Sorry, my next slide.
Look, I often think one of the power combinations for a lot of buyers is affordability plus infrastructure plus jobs nodes, and certainly this region, the Moreton Bay region, has all of that to offer. It's the sort of the northern outer ring area, I suppose, of the Brisbane metropolitan area. It includes some bayside areas. There's lots of great infrastructure in place, rail links, for example, including the relatively new rail link to the Redcliffe Peninsula, which is part of this region. close to major jobs nodes. The biggest jobs node in Brisbane is in actual fact what they call the Trade Coast area, which includes the Brisbane Airport, including the International Airport, and the Brisbane Seaport. They're all clustered together in the northern part of Brisbane. And that's an absolutely massive jobs node, all the industrial and commercial stuff that's sprung up around the seaport and the airport. So very affordable suburbs up in this area where you've got median prices in the 300,000s for houses and 400,000, some a little bit more expensive, but certainly it's easy to buy in the 300,000s in this market and be close to major jobs nodes like that with great infrastructure, great shopping, lots of schools, all of that. And the rental yields are sort of 4.5% to 5.5%. Very popular markets, high turnover because of the affordability, both home buyers and investor buyers. And one of the new things coming up that's kind of going to add impetus to this area is the new university campus. They're underway with it. It's not just a plan that politicians are talking about. That the land's been bought and construction has started to build a new university campus around about the Petrie area of the Moreton Bay region, and that's going to add that extra element that I really like to see. University campus is great to have in a market that you're buying in.
Yeah, that's right.
Because it's a huge jobs node, but it's also got all these students looking for somewhere to rent close by. And it's going to give further impetus to this area.
No, I love the university areas. I think they're great. I think there's a lot of economic spin-off from those sort of areas too. But that new train line that goes through to Kippa-Ring up that way, that's really up to the Redcliffe Peninsula. You also got the North Lake Shopping Centre, and you got a big Costco's out there. So some of those, those big warehouse type of retailers are also attracting a lot of activity. An interesting factor, though, too, Terry, is that the land, when you look at land developments out there, a lot of the land subdivisions, I remember buying a number of properties many, many years ago. I got very early on into the Rothwell market and helped a lot of investors get in well before the market took off. But the land sizes now for a lot of the new subdivisions is reduced from around about 600 square metre blocks down to around 420 square metres per block. So it just goes to show that developers are trying to chop their developments up into smaller amounts just to catch up with demand in those areas.
Yeah. So you can buy in those areas slightly older properties where you've got much bigger land sizes. That's part of the attraction. You can buy 3 and 4 bedroom houses, brick and tile homes, pretty solid on 700, 800, 900 square metre blocks, sometimes bigger. And
exactly,
that's an attraction in that area.
Exactly.
You mentioned the retail offering. I would emphasise that it's a massive retail offering up there, not just the shopping centre, but the bulky goods stuff. There's a new IKEA superstore quite recently opened in that precinct, as well as the Costco and the Bunnings type things. Massive facilities, and I was recently there on a Saturday morning, and believe me, the traffic flowing in and out of the area was just colossal. It's hugely popular, and that's a big element, not only for the amenity of the area, but again, these are huge jobs nodes.
Well, just wait till that other German company. I mean, we've got Aldi already here, but there's another group company called Kaufland that are doing a big aggressive expansion campaign right around Australia, and they're looking for sites at the moment too. So I wouldn't be surprised if they find a site very similar in that sort of similar region there to meet that demographic.
There's an additional element to mention about real estate up here, and we've touched on it in relation to Newcastle, and that's the opportunity to buy properties where you can value add or do extra things. I know, for example, the Deception Bay area, it's kind of a down market bayside area, but it's actually evolving into something a little bit better gradually. As the name suggests, it's on the water, very affordable, but there are properties there where the land size and the zoning allows you get a house on land that's rentable with a good return, but in the future you can redevelop with 3 or 4 or 6 townhouses, for example. Those opportunities exist in some of these areas as well.
Well, look, I mean, Terry, just where you're talking, that Deception Bay is just to the north of Rothwell, Kippa-Ring, Clontarf, Redcliffe. Those areas around that Redcliffe Peninsula have been very highly picked over and highly sought after. But as you say, just to the north, those areas that are being gentrified around Deception Bay, I think has a lot of potential. It's a bit like, I wouldn't quite call it an ugly duckling, but it's certainly an area that is going to go through a transformation as we go forward. I guess, Terry, just quickly talk about the rental market, and then just talk about what infrastructure is going into Brisbane, and then I want to talk about some other areas as well. I guess you mentioned some of the infrastructure going into Brisbane in your introduction, and I just picked out some figures that I'd like to share with our audience tonight. We've got Queen's Wharf in Brisbane. That's a $3 billion redevelopment of the Queen's Wharf area. It's going to be like an integrated resort area. There's going to be 5 new hotels, 50 restaurants, a 1,500-seat ballroom, open-air cinema. It's really going to revitalise and bring a lot of even more of the trend factor to that inner-city Brisbane area. You've got Millennium Square at Bowen Hills. That's a $2 billion precinct where they're creating a world-class media and innovation hub. We've got a new runway going into the airport. We've got the Brisbane Metro, which is a turn-up-and-go bus service, which is being constructed over 21 kilometres, going to have 18 stations, 944 million to construct that, and that will generate a significant amount of benefit as well. We've also got another wharf area redevelopment, which is the Howard Smith Wharf area, which is just underneath the Story Bridge. Again, they're creating a new entertainment precinct, lifestyle cafes right there in the heart of the city. Also, the Brisbane International Cruise Terminal. It's already in existence, but they're doing an upgrade. They're spending $158 million improving that to cater for those mega ships, a bit like, what's that one, the Ovation of the Seas, and some of the larger ships so they can get into there. But those cruise ship terminals generate a phenomenal amount of benefit, around $5 billion in benefit they're expecting to generate that in the next 15 years. What have I missed, Terry? Any other ones I've missed? Cross River Rail, that's supposed to be 2021. Anything else I've missed?
No, I think I was just going to mention the Cross River Rail, but I think you've touched on all the major ones. The second runway at the airport's hugely important. Anyone who's flown into Brisbane and the plane arrives over Brisbane on time, they spend 15 or 30 minutes circling until you get a chance to land because they desperately need that second runway.
That's right.
It's a big factor. But all of those projects you mentioned, they're all big projects and they're all going to generate a lot of jobs in construction, but perhaps more importantly, a lot of jobs in the operation of them. The infrastructure I like the most is the ones where there's actually more jobs in the running of them after they're built than actually the building of them. And a university is that type of infrastructure, a hospital as well, and some of those tourism facilities are going to mean a lot of jobs once they're up and running.
No, that's great. And Terry, what about vacancy rates? We've seen that the vacancy rates for the Greater Brisbane area is currently sitting at around 2.7%. But have you seen any other figures on where the vacancy rate's sitting in the Brisbane market?
Yeah, well, the latest figures out from SQM show that the Brisbane vacancy rate has been trending down quite strongly. Where it's at now, I think you mentioned, it's below 3%. Overall for Brisbane. It's much lower than it was 12 months ago. The majority of that vacancy has been in the inner city apartment markets. When you go further out, vacancy is pretty tight. And in the Moreton Bay region that we have focused on here today, vacancies are very low in that market. It's one of the reasons why the rental yields are so solid there.
That's right.
Overall, vacancies aren't a problem for Brisbane, and the vacancy rates are trending downwards quite strongly, and that's going to continue to be the case, I think, because as you mentioned, there's going to be limited future construction of apartments in the next little while where they soak up that surplus, and the population growth numbers are so strong that it's going to help eat into any existing vacancies as well.
Yeah, okay. Look, we might just move into some strategies now, Terry, and we'll have a look at, and we'll again talk about some areas as we go through these, but I'm just going to give again some case studies on what we've recently done for our clients, a property buyer here for investor clients buying into the Brisbane market. Stuart Fraser in my team is our expert who is on the ground helping our clients to find these types of properties. But this one on the screen here, it's just a typical high set Brisbane home. You can see that there's an under floor area there that's been able to be used for a dwelling. We got this property for $385,000 in the Logan Shire. It rents for $500 a week. So again, big land size, 850 square metres. Now, what we love about it is our client can put a granny flat in the backyard for 125 grand. That's a 2-bedroom granny flat. And that flat will generate an additional $280 a week in rental return. So when you combine the rent of the house of $500 with the rent of the flat, you're going to give you a yield of just under 8%. And just consider that this property is only 30 minutes to the Brisbane CBD. So great, strongly positive cash flow property with great potential to add some value to. Another one that we recently bought was an established duplex. Rather than having to build one, we actually found one off market. I should mention the other one we bought was also off market, again through our connections with agents. But we found this one, existing duplex, rents for $350 per side, so it gives you a total rent of $700 a week. We purchased this for $535. Still fairly modern, only built about 7 years ago in 2000 7 years ago, 2009, 9 years ago, sorry. But again, yields around 6.8%. So good quality property. Hard to find these ones. A lot of people are building them from scratch. But where we found a very motivated vendor on this one, we're able to capitalise really well. Sorry, Terry?
I'm just struck by the numbers. I just imagine anybody watching and listening who's perhaps sitting in Sydney and Melbourne, looking at the first one you put up where you're buying for $350,000, that's a revelation. Yeah. But the rental, $500 a week, and the rental yield, plus the potential to subdivide. I mean, that's right. Yeah. I mean, it's kind of eye-watering, isn't it, for investors sitting in those bigger cities? The pricing, the rental yields, and the
that's right. Yeah, that's right. Well, again, this one here was in the Logan Shire, and I think you've written a number of reports before about Logan, and I won't sort of go over it too much, but just sort of mention it. The Logan City area, it contains about 60 suburbs. We only buy in about 10 of them that we think have strong potential. But the interesting factor is that the volume of sales, Terry, as you probably know, is almost doubled in the last 6 years in that Logan area. So that's obviously a precursor to seeing prices rise.
Yeah.
And it's growing. Logan, they actually estimate that they need to build around 9,000 dwellings in the next, or in the last 5 years, but they only supplied about 7,500 homes. So there's still actually a relative shortage of properties in the Logan Shire. So they're saying it could be undersupplied by up to 20%. So that's going to, again, put pressure on pricing. The other factor is that to do a granny flat in the Brisbane area, you can't do it anywhere. You can't just do it in any particular suburb like in New South Wales, where there's an affordable planning set. Each individual council has a regulation, and you need to understand what the setbacks and the requirements are. They're also, unfortunately, bringing in an additional charge. They call it an auxiliary flat charge.
Yes.
Doing this, and I think it's around $10,000. So it doesn't mean it's uneconomic, but it's just another cost factor that you've got to factor into in doing your numbers on these types of investments.
Yeah.
Another example, these are a couple of just simple buy and hold strategies that we did for our clients. Again, really, really affordable price points. One here for $324,000. This rents for $400 a week, giving a gross yield of 6.42%. Again, that was a four-bedroom, 2-bathroom, double lockout garage home. And the one down below the screen, $259,000. So again, you still can buy houses in Brisbane under $300K if you know where to look and find the right opportunities. And again, strong yield, just over the 6.5% mark. We also did another strategy with a granny flat. We purchased this one on a big block, 800 square metre block. Currently, the house rents for $420 a week. Again, we'll be adding the granny flat for $125, taking the rent up to $700 per week. So we're getting a yield of over 7%. So when you do the numbers, I think I've got a slide with the numbers. Yeah, just on this one. So I plugged in the numbers into our PIA spreadsheet. And this is what it does. So if you take a purchase of both, what have we got? The house at $370 and the flat at $125. So your total investment, $495,000. And we're going to assume a capital growth rate of 6%, which should be quite achievable for this area. In the first year, you'll generate an after-tax cash flow of $7,437, or just over $140 per week. So take that into account that you've got a positive cash flow, but if you do get a 6% capital growth rate, again, it's a projection, you're going to be generating an additional equity base of 378,000 over 10 years. So for me, it's a no-brainer, that kind of investment. I'd have 10 of these or more in my portfolio every day of the week if I could afford to get loans for them. This is just a great opportunity for investors to get both a positive cash flow property with a reasonable, strong growth return as well. Another example we did of a house, we bought this one for $367. It rents for $400 a week. We added a granny flat, and again got a strong yield over 7%. So, I mean, the houses aren't particularly flash. They're just, on reasonable blocks of land. The trick is that we always get a pest and building done to make sure that the house is structurally sound and it's got no major issues. Often there'll be a few minor things, cosmetic things to fix. So it's really important that we do those checks and that you understand what you're buying. And we can often negotiate a slightly cheaper price if we find anything major wrong with the house. So we've had a number of investors do this particular strategy and really happy with the result going forward. I guess, Terry, any thoughts on the Brisbane market, or any kind of other thoughts about ways in which investors can move forward?
Look, I just think the examples you put on the screen reiterate a lot of things that are attractive about Brisbane for investors. The affordability factor, the prices you pay for property and the potential yield you can get, particularly those ones where you can add value, like putting in a granny flat. The Brisbane metropolitan area abounds with those sorts of opportunities. I don't say they're easy to find, but they're out there. The Logan area we've touched on, the Moreton Bay area, but also out in Ipswich City. I think it's probably the cheapest part of the Brisbane market. That's where you're most likely to find buying in the 200,000s. Lots of jobs nodes out there, including some big new ones coming up with government contracts, and great potential to buy affordably for good rental returns and growth, because a lot of the jobs are heading out that way.
Well, I think, Terry, one of the messages that we also want to drive home is that it's important to do your research, get the right team around you to spend money on your reports, and also consider engaging a buyer's agent to help you do the process, because if you try to do it all on your own, it takes a lot of time and you can often get stuck. So it's certainly important to get the right team around you. In terms of what we charge a property buyer for our service, everyone asks what's the cost. So I've just put a quick slide in there. We charge a flat fee for our services for any property under 500K, which is all those examples I've given, particularly in the Brisbane market. It's just 9,000 plus GST. If it's above that, we just work on, again, a flat fee around the 2% mark. But the benefit is you get access to so many more properties. The majority of properties we find are off market. You'll never see them advertised on realestate.com. We have a very strong relationship with localised agents we can trust. We don't get any fees from them. We are only paid by the buyer, and that's by how I've set up my business, to be exclusive buyers agents. But we also negotiate really well. We save our clients as much money as we can on the negotiation, but also just fast track the research and get everything done. So it really, there's another level of protection that we can offer our clients. And these are the 7 steps that we go through for all of our clients. We'll sit down, we'll discuss a strategy, find one that works for you. We'll do the research, we'll shortlist properties. We'll help select the best one. We evaluate it, we negotiate it, conduct the due diligence, and then secure and get the property exchanged for you. We'll also help you locate a local property manager that will look after the property and collect the rent and look after the tenants on your behalf. So a lot of investors, fast track or bypass some of these steps. You can't bypass these steps. You need to do each of them well, and get the right team around you to help you get to where you need to go. Any other thoughts, Terry, on what investors need to do to really move forward with their portfolio?
Yeah, I'd just like to reiterate the value of engaging a good buyer's agent. I think most of us are really time poor. With the best of intentions, I just don't think I personally have the time in my busy business life and personal life to do it all myself. So I think there's great value in engaging a good buyer's agent like yourself. And I know that because you made the point about negotiating well, in many cases, I think you save the client your fee by negotiating a lower price. So they would actually probably end up ahead in net terms in terms of their costs. But finding those, being able to find those opportunities, particularly the off-market ones. They have those little twists, but I think increasingly property investors are looking for. More and more investors don't just want a passive investment. They want something that's got the ability to subdivide, to add the granny flat, to accelerate the process. And
that's
I
right.
think that your guys, because they're doing it every day, have the ability to sniff those out more readily than somebody going online on realestate.com trying to find them themselves. So
that's right. Well, we can help coordinate the whole process. It's not just about finding the property. It's about working out what to pay, because some agents will price the property at over what it should go for. Some will underprice it, and some will price it exactly what it needs to sell for. So it's really important to get an objective opinion on what a property's worth and how to go about securing it. And the other thing, when it comes to adding the value, it's about having the right contacts, the right builder, the right renovator who can step in and help you coordinate that process. That's very, very time consuming. And look, sure, we can negotiate really hard, but it's not always about negotiating. It's also about picking the right asset, the right property in a location and paying fair market value so it goes forward. There's nothing worse than buying the wrong property that just sits and it's just going to be a dud for 10 years. You've got to get the right property, and that's where it's certainly worth the money. Terry, maybe just to wrap up today, we've talked a lot about Newcastle and gone through the benefits. We've talked about Brisbane. I guess from my perspective, I see them as both long-term buy and hold markets. I've got properties in those markets, and I'm not going to be selling them anytime soon. But for our investors, I'd strongly recommend considering those markets and moving forward, particularly as the Sydney and Melbourne markets are on a correctional phase. But any final comments to wrap up, Terry?
Yeah, I'd just like to reiterate that there are strong growth markets with potential for capital growth around Australia, that I think investors need to cut through all the media static about what's going on in real estate and realise that there's locations like Newcastle and Brisbane that have got enormous growth potential, both short-term and long-term, and that they shouldn't be deterred. They should continue to research and move forward.
Great. Well, look, I'd just like to say thank you so much for attending the webinar tonight with Terry Ryder and myself. We hope you've enjoyed it, and we hope you get some value. I'd like to encourage you to visit Terry Ryder's website, hotspotting.com.au, and myself at propertybuyer.com.au. You see my details there on the screen. Please send us an email or log on our website and share your thoughts. But from now, thank you so much for being with us, and we look forward to being with you again very soon. Bye for now.